My name is Elizabeth Zelle, and I'm from Volition. And I'm really happy for the opportunity to come and talk to you guys about a subject matter that is near and dear to my heart, both personally and professionally, which is the idea of having inclusive and diverse mechanics built into video games. So in this presentation, I'm going to be talking a lot about Volition games, specifically the Saints Row series that we're best known for, at least recently. I'm going to give examples from other games as well. We're not the only people doing this in the entire world. And because I am a scientist and I come from a science background, I'm going to be talking about a lot of the science behind the ideas that I'm talking about. A lot of people have a pretty good gut instinct. Oh yeah, making diverse games has got to be great. But why? And some people might challenge you. Why is diversity needed? Well, I'm actually going to prepare you with some science that you can have. They're like, there are actual psychological principles behind why making diverse games is not only good for society, but is good for your bottom line as a game developer. Because you can increase your player retention rates, ooh, buzzwords, and you can actually expand your market by appealing to a broader array of gamers. So, as I said, who am I? I'm Elizabeth. Mostly you'll hear me called Zelly if you ever do come to the Volition offices. That's my Twitter handle for the people who like to follow people on social media. I'm an associate user researcher. Now here comes the big question. What is a user researcher? Everyone's like, I know what a designer does and what an artist does and what a programmer does, but what in the world is a user researcher? So my role is fairly small. My department's tiny. There are 4 of us. And that is a very recent development. Until a few months ago, there were 2 of us. And we science the video game. We don't create content. We don't add anything directly into the game. We don't tell people how to fix problems. We just identify problem areas, and we identify trends in player behavior. So during pre-production and production, we run a lot of tests, playtests, bring people in from the outside, put them down in front of the game. Sometimes that's a particular mechanic, and we'll only have them in game for 30 minutes. Towards the end of the cycle, that's a 3-day playtest where they come in day after day after day and play a bunch of content in the game. And we look, in that case, for areas of confusion and frustration. What are things that would make a player rage quit our game? Because we want to get rid of that before we ship. We want to try and find all these areas where the designer's intended player experience and what players are actually feeling have a big gap between them, and we provide data to our development team to try and help them find solutions to try and bring these 2 things, intended experience and actual experience, closer together. After release, we do a lot with telemetry data, so we look at actual player behavior in the wild, basically, and we crunch numbers and look for patterns and how players are utilizing the game that we built and put out into the wild. And that data can help inform future game decisions we make. So I'm going to start with a couple premises for this presentation. If you disagree with these facts, this presentation is not going to do much for you. Fact number 1 is that video game characters right now tend not to be very diverse. Fact 2, that this diversity in characters is not reflecting the diversity of our player base. We have a really diverse player base of people who want to play games. The characters they're seeing in games aren't reflecting their own diversity. Inclusive characters can make some players feel good. And inclusive characters may increase motivation to play. This is not a universal, doesn't mean everybody. So there's this player need to see elements of themselves reflected in games that they play. And does not mean all players are equally motivated by this need. And it does not mean that all games have to address this particular need. It's just one of many player needs. It's just that this player need is going to be the one that I focus on talking about this evening. So we'll start real basic. Let's go to the dictionary. What do I mean by inclusivity? Well, it's just an intention or policy of trying to include people who might otherwise be feeling excluded or marginalized. Which then begs the question, how are people feeling excluded from games right now? Who is feeling excluded from games right now? And basically players who aren't seeing their own gender, their own ethnicity, their own sexuality or body types reflected and represented in this medium may be feeling excluded from it. So I love these slides, and I was really excited to get an opportunity to recreate it. This is the past 3.5 years top-selling games. Let's try and find authored female characters. Authored female characters mean a game where the design intent was for you to play a very specific female character with a very specific backstory. So first of all, let's get rid of anything that's a sports game and is just recreating real-life people. And now let's get rid of male protagonists. And I'm not trying to hate on anybody, because this is where Saints Row falls, but let's get rid of any games that rely on a customization system or having players select from a cast of characters to fulfill their needs for diversity. And we're left with 2, and Last of Us is a real stretch, since most of the game you actually play as a male protagonist. There are some elements in the main storyline where you do play female, and there's a DLC pack where you play as a female, so I'm kind of stretching, and I'll give them credit for it. But so in the last 3.5 years of top-selling games, if we're looking for a discreetly designed female character experience, this is all we're left with. And if I recreated this slide and I did it with people who are LGBT, we'd end up with really similar, if not worse, results. And if I recreated this slide and did it with people of color, once again, we'd end up with really poor results. And so this just goes to show that when I say the games aren't particularly diverse right now, this is what I'm talking about. And if you don't trust slides with pretty pictures, let's look at a graph. So this comes from a study done, now it's a little old, 2009. They looked at 150 games released in one calendar year. And they looked at how many of the characters were male or female. And as you can see, the first column, 85% of the characters are male. Now, what if you're just saying, I'm not looking at all characters, I'm talking just about the protagonist, the main character of the game. Then that jumps up to nearly 90% of the games that came out that year had a male main character, and only 10.45% had a female main character. What if you're also interested in looking at race? Well, same census, same year of data. Now we're looking at how represented a particular ethnicity is in games versus how representative it is in the US population based off of census data. And so what you see in the beginning is that white people are being overrepresented in games. Almost all other ethnic groups are being underrepresented based off of their percentage of the population in the US. You do get a slight uptick at Asian Pacific Islander, and that's not because American game devs are doing a great job, that's because Japanese game devs are. They're representing themselves in games, which is increasing that particular segment. So why is representation important? So we've established, yes, games not particularly diverse right now. Why does it matter? Well, you could say it matters socially. We have, something to do for our society. If you look at social identity theory, which is a psychological theory, the presence of portrayals of a particular group serves as an indicator of that group's weight in society. Basically, the more you see your own group represented in your media, the more you're internalizing that your society values that particular group. So the opposite side of that coin is when there's an absence of portrayals of your group, it can lead to feelings of relative unimportance and powerlessness. So by games heavily overrepresenting certain demographics, it's sending subconscious messages to people of other demographics that, hey, even though you're good enough to pay money for my game, your society doesn't value you as much. But what if you say, I don't care about the social reasons, all I care about is the bottom line and monies. So why is it important to selling your games? Players that can see aspects of themselves reflected in game characters can form deeper, faster, which is real important too for player retention purposes, emotional connections to those characters. And these players that have these emotional connections can have an increased motivation to play the title. Player retention, yeah, buzzwords. So it can be good for your bottom line to be socially representative, in addition to being good for society as a whole. So I'm going to talk about a psychological principle called virtual self. And it stems from self-discrepancy theory, which talks about the idea of there's actual self and there's ideal self. Actual self is who you are. Who is in your body right now. Ideal self is this kind of nebulous idea you hold in your head of who the perfect version of you would be. And the more distance there is between who you actually are and who you wish you were, tendencies lead to having lower self-esteem and having more depression issues. That you have this idea of who you want to be and you're not meeting it. A really great example of this is someone who may be a trans individual but hasn't yet transitioned. That they may have an actual self that's one thing, but their ideal self is something completely different. And so they might have a lot of problems because they have such discrepancy between the two. And video games are really awesome because they offer an opportunity for a middle ground self, something called a virtual self. So maybe this little kitten really wants to be a lion, obviously isn't fulfilling this in his actual self right now, but in the meantime can create an avatar in Skyrim and play a Khajiit, and can get some aspects of their ideal self into this virtual self. And so they can actually get somewhere kind of halfway there between these two. So video games and the virtual self allows for exploration. They're intrinsically motivating in part because they provide a context in which players can explore different aspects of themselves and try on ideal characteristics. So everyone remembers being kind of like an awkward 14-year-old and you weren't quite sure what it was you wanted to be. Maybe you tried different fashion styles to figure that out. Well, this is talking about the same idea kind of on a psychological level, that playing in different video game characters, experiencing different things in video games, can allow you to experiment and try on aspects of your personality. It can improve mental well-being. For those individuals who have low self-esteem because they have a big discrepancy between actual and ideal self, that virtual self middle ground can actually help improve their self-esteem and lower rates of depression because they're getting the psychological fulfillment of having some of these aspects of their ideal self represented in this video game character. And this kind of virtual self-play is much more impactful to female users, to older users, and possibly people of color. I say possibly, it's just because the research isn't as strong in that particular area, but it's leaning that way anyways. That basically women users and older users tend to use avatar creation systems to recreate aspects of their real life selves and aspects of these ideal selves in the character they're creating. So some other science I'm going to touch on briefly as well about why having characters that are more diverse can be helpful. In-group favoritism. It's a cognitive bias, and we're all just like, oh, cognitive biases are by default bad. Cognitive bias is just a pattern, and if you're creating games, you can sometimes take advantage of these known patterns in human thinking. And this is just a pattern of favoring members of one's own group. So if you load a game and the character you see on the very first screen matches some kind of internal group you place yourself in, you are instantly, on an unconscious level, going to have a stronger emotional attachment to that character. It's not the same as outgroup negativity, where you have negative emotions towards different groups, but you can actually take advantage of the fact that people will relate more strongly if they see characters that they feel they are somehow connected to. And then there's an idea called presence, sometimes called telepresence, which is basically just this psychological state in which virtual objects are experienced as actual objects. So basically, it's this whole idea that kind of on a subconscious level, you treat things happening in your video game in a very similar way to you would treat them if they were happening in the real world. So some players have a need for presence, or a tendency to enjoy feeling there, or seeing parts of themselves present in the game environment they're playing. And so this is another way where you can get kind of increased psychological buy-in from your player base. And once again, it's important to remember, players value characters in a ton of different ways. What I've been talking about so far is just basically identity and self-expression. There's a ton of other ways that players value the characters they have in-game. For example, if you're playing a first-person shooter and you're hardcore into the multiplayer, what you probably value most is utility. How well are you able to achieve your goals in-game with this particular character you've chosen? And so this might influence the class you pick and how you arm them. So there are different ways to value characters, and a game doesn't have to meet all of them. That's kind of the part of being a game dev, is as you create this game, you get to pick and choose which things you're going to focus on with your title. So I'm going to switch gears a little bit. We're going to leave a lot of the science behind, and we're going to move to talking about Saints Row. So, Saints Row. How has Saints Row approached inclusivity and diversity? We have character customization. We have a diverse array of NPC characters. We make sure our scripts and our romances and our clothing are neutral. They're gender neutral. It doesn't matter what you do in character customization. The game respects your character regardless. We learn from our mistakes, because boy, have we made them. And we make sure we don't single out specific groups with our humor. So Saints Row is obviously a funny game. We make fun of everybody. But we don't actually kind of make fun of everybody. We understand that there are certain groups in society who it's not okay to make fun of. It's the whole punching up versus punching down idea. And so even though on the surface Saints Row reads as a we don't give a shit, we'll just make fun of everyone, and here's a toilet to dress up as game, and we do actually have a policy. If you go in our writing room and talk to our writers, they'll agree, is there are certain lines we make sure we don't cross. And it's one of those things that because we're doing it right, no one notices. If we did it wrong, it'd be really obvious. But it's really important to us in the development process to make sure we don't cross these specific boundaries when it comes to our humor. So, talk about the history of the Saints Row series. This is a screenshot from the character creation system of Saints Row 1. Came out way back in 2006. It had fairly limited customization, and by that I mean you couldn't change your gender. You could only play as a dude. You at least had the option to change your ethnicity, but you were still stuck as a dude no matter what you wanted. And we had a diverse cast because it was a gangster game, but we leaned really heavily on stereotypes, which wasn't good. This is one of those mistakes we've made in the past that we are trying to move away from that I was talking about. It was definitely West Coast urban gang culture through the lens of Midwest white guys. And we were definitely perpetuating some hurtful and damaging stereotypes in some of our earlier games. So Saints Row 2, we really went all in, kind of balls to the wall with our customization system. Not only did it allow you to switch gender, we actually had gender on a slider, so you could move it across back and forth, and there was gray areas between male and female. We had, you can see on the far side there, personality as a tab. We let you change your voice. We also let you change your melee fighting style. We also let you change your walk animation cycle. Like, we went all in. We're like, we're going to give people every option they could possibly want when it comes to a customization system. And we made a mistake there too. Well, not necessarily a mistake, because it was successful. But what we learned, though, is that customization systems are not easy to develop. They're very resource intensive. So let's say we have a dozen different walk styles to pick from. Let's say you're a character animator. That's a dozen different animations that you have to do for those dozen different walk styles. And so while we were going into customization with really great intentions, what we discovered is that sometimes when it comes down to it, we are a business. And we have to make choices about where we put our resources in development. So going into Saints Row 3, we streamlined player customization. We moved back a little bit in some areas, and that wasn't because we didn't see the value in those things. Some fans are upset that we made some of these changes and took away some customization options, and I understand why. We see the value in them. We see why fans value them. But as a company, we needed to make decisions about where our resources were best allocated. So we kept most of customization. We just streamlined it. We did also add the lovely sex appeal slider, as you can see evidenced here. On men, it would increase bulge size, and on women, breast size. And a lot of that had to do with the fact that we went just kind of full-on satire. We really embraced humor as our angle. We're no longer trying to be a GTA clone like we were in Saints Row 1, and Saints Row 2 was going the dark humor route, but it was still kind of holding on to its gangster roots. Here we said, you know what, that's not where our bread and butter is. What we do really well is making fun of GTA. So that's kind of what we embraced when we got to Saints Row 3. Oh, sorry. And when we got time to Saints Row 4, we were just full-on satire now of the entire gaming industry, basically. We poked fun at everybody with love. So we added romances, kind of making fun of certain other studios, cough, BioWare cough, who have long, complex romance, trees that you have to follow. So instead, in our game, if you got to a certain point in an NPC's quest line, you would walk up to them in your home ship, and there would be a button. Press X to romance. And if you pressed X, you would instantly see a cutscene of you and that NPC engaging in romance. We'll just leave it at that. I do not have a video or animated GIF to show you, I'm sorry. One thing we did do with that, though, is unlike what BioWare does, because they're trying to recreate very realistic relationships, we don't have any limits on gender. So even if you're playing a female character model, if that's how you designed your boss, it doesn't matter. You can still romance everybody on that ship, male, woman, and robot. And we do have a robot you can romance. If you haven't played Saints Row 4, there's a good selling point right there. And we introduced in Saints Row 4 a number of new NPCs of color. And we did it we purposely tried to be really respectful about it. We knew we'd kind of screwed this part up in the past in this particular series, and we wanted to make sure that we were going to be doing it in a much better, or at least trying harder way. So Saints Row 4, it's the most recent full-length Saints Row title that came out. It's now over 2 years old. What did we do? We had an inclusive protagonist. So we allowed total customization of the boss. And then, on top of that, the game was totally neutral, both gender and ethnicity neutral on how it reacted to the character you'd created. We actually, if we were fairly late in development, getting close to submission, and we realized that in one cutscene, one NPC referred to your character as Mr. President. And it was a high priority bug that went in to get that line out of the game, because somehow it had slipped through the whole process, no one had yet noticed. And it was that important to us that this game remain neutral and respect the player's choices, that it became high priority mere weeks before submission to go in and remove this particular voice line. And, there was a situation where, when we were first started adding clothing items into the store, one of our designers thought, wouldn't it be nice to organize it so people had an easier time? So I'm going to make male and female categories. And some other people in the studio had to go and actually, wait. That's not how we handle our game. That our game actually, all of our clothing, we do not make any judgment statements with our clothing. A piece of clothing is not male or female, it is just a piece of clothing and can be worn by any character. And we don't even, it's not that we said, oh, you can't wear a skirt if you're a male, even though it's under the female category. We didn't even want that judgment to be there. So if a player wanted to put a skirt on their male character, there wasn't anything about the game suggesting that maybe what they were doing wasn't appropriate. So we had a diverse supporting cast. So the main cast of Saints Row 4 is about 10 major NPCs that you hang out with and spend a lot of the game with. Less than 50% of them are white dudes. And you might be, yay? But then think about the rest of video games and realize that that's actually huge to have less than 50% of a cast be made up of white guys. That we had 4 different female characters, and that's of course if you count Shaundi twice. There's a lot of some time travel kind of stuff going on. It's very weird in Saints Row 4. So the same character does end up doubling down. And then if you look at our people of color, we have Keith David actually playing himself. Keith David. Sorry, typo. And we have character Ben King, we have Johnny Gat, who is Asian. Some people don't realize that, but he is. And then Asha Odakar's character we introduced in this game, who's actually an Indian female. And completely badass. And so we wanted to make sure that we were trying. That look at us, we're trying, we're learning from our mistakes. We want to make sure that even though we're allowing you to have the ability to make your main character look like what you want, that's not where we're going to stop. We're going to make sure the whole cast is diverse. And as I was saying, we tried to avoid stereotypes and tokenism, which is kind of the other side of that coin. That you're like, I'm going to make sure that we have a great set of characters, and there's going to be one of these and one of these and one of these. Look how diverse we are. And that sometimes is a trap you can fall into when you're really pushing for diversity in a title. So these are things we tried to avoid hopefully successfully, but once again, it's a process. We're never going to be perfect. There's always better ways that, things we could be doing better. So next, we're going to go back to a little bit of data again. I'm a scientist. I'm sorry, I love charts. So this particular chart is a chart of my data. I collected data. During Saints Row 4 playtesting, we did 10 weeks of playtesting leading up to the submission of that title. That is, every week we had a 3-day playtest where we brought in approximately 8 playtesters for 3 days in a row. So this is 81 players worth of data in the 10 weeks leading up to submission of our title. And what I did was I just observed how did players utilize the customization system we gave them. Because we know that it's there, and we know from our telemetry data that people use it. But our telemetry data doesn't ever match up with real-world people. So here was my opportunity to have a person in front of me and ask them, what gender do you identify with? What ethnicities do you identify with? And then put them in a game and watch them use our customization system. So first off, we have males. Approximately 40% of males created a male character in their initial round of customization. 100% of women did. 100% of our female playtesters in their initial player customization created a female character. About 60% of our white playtesters created a white character, and 100% of our African American playtesters and 100% of our Hispanic playtesters created characters that represented their own ethnicity in the game. And about 2/3 of our Asian playtesters did as well. I had a hypothesis that people would do something along those lines, but very rarely when you're collecting real-world data, you ever see 100%. And so to see this data, even though it was collected and analyzed post hoc, this isn't good enough to publish a paper with. But this is obviously something that I would say further research is required, because these are really strong trends. And in that same set of data, those 81 playtesters, nearly 85% of them engaged in at least some form of customization. Because you have the option, you can just spam the button through the customization menu and come out with default white dude. If you don't care, we remove most barriers. It is 3 button presses to get through those menus. You can accomplish it in less than 5 seconds. And women and players of color were very likely to recreate core elements of their own selves in their boss when they went through initial customization. Now, what were the white men doing then? Because they weren't recreating themselves as often. But the answer is they were more likely to create kind of the wacky off-the-wall characters. They were still engaging with the system. So if you're looking at it from a dev standpoint of were these resources wasted on this system, our white male users were still utilizing it quite heavily. They just weren't utilizing it the same ways. So in Saints Row 4, there are 55 different skin tones you can pick from, 20 of which I classify as realistic, and the rest of them kind of fall into the category of fantasy skin tones. If you want to make a Jolly Green Giant, you can make a Jolly Green Giant. If you want to make the Silver Surfer, that is also an option. And so our white male users were much more likely to kind of create those really crazy, push the extremes types of characters when they utilized the system. And something I found really interesting is I also looked at which elements of customization were used most frequently. So let's say, for example, we want to create the most streamlined, pared-down customization system we can that still addresses player need. And what I found is that the things that were used most often were the changes that made very big, sweeping impact that allowed people to recreate really core elements of themselves. People aren't interested in recreating their nose in-game as much as they're interested in recreating their gender. So gender, body type. In Saints Row 4, we had a body triangle that went from muscular to thin to fat, and you could put it anywhere you wanted in that triangle. Skin color, hairstyle, and voice. We had 6 voice options. 3 male, 3 female, and zombie. And no, zombie was Saints Row 3. Nolan North. Sorry, Saints Row 4, Nolan North was we had 3 male voice options, 3 female, and Nolan North. Actually labeled in the menu as Nolan North. And you could apply any of those voices to your character regardless of what gender you'd picked. And so these 6 choices were the most frequently used by far. And so people weren't as interested in engaging with the really fine-tuned stuff. Some players are. Boy, I can tell you from telemetry data, some players spend tens of hours in our customization menus. So some players are obviously engaging with the extreme ends of customization. But for the majority of our players, it doesn't take much to create a character they identify with. So the conclusion I came to from the data I collected is that Saints Row 4 playtesters use our customization system to create a diverse array of bosses. And they frequently reflect core aspects of their actual selves. And because they're choosing to do this and they don't have to, you can kind of take that the next step to say, that's something these players value. They want to see this reflected in the game they're about to spend the next 3 days playing. So the hypothesis is that players who are underrepresented in games, and that means women and people of color, will take opportunities to see themselves. You don't often see yourselves in a game. You don't often get to play a protagonist that looks like you, and you get a game that lets you play that protagonist, you take it most of the time. And then players who do get to see themselves represented often get to use the customization system to experiment more. Maybe you're a white guy, but you're tired of always having to play white guy characters. And so here's your opportunity to do something different, to play around and have some fun. And guess what? I'm not the only person who's noticed these trends. So here's some data from a research paper that says that while women are more likely to create avatars that are idealized versions of themselves, which I mentioned earlier, male users tend to favor avatars that are more stand out in a crowd. And so the patterns I saw of women recreating themselves and male users creating wacky avatars isn't just for Saints Row, it has been found in other types of games as well. So players in this playtesting session spent on average roughly 5 minutes in customization. And you might say, well, 5 minutes is nothing. Believe me, devs at Volition have said 5 minutes isn't a lot. Is this a waste of our resources to put into a customization system? It's only 5 minutes long. So here's the video of 5 minutes of customization in Saints Row 4 sped up into 30 seconds. And this is split across actual character customization and clothing customization, but it just gives you a real quick idea that 5 minutes is actually a ton of time. Players can accomplish a ton in 5 minutes. And so really the lesson to take away here, and this probably should have Yakity's axe playing over it because of the rate at which they're breathing and it gets really creepy, is that sometimes you'll see a number, someone says 5 minutes, average time 5 minutes, and you will make an assumption about it. Be really wary of that. Actually investigate it. Because believe me, if I told some of our devs that people only spent 5 minutes in customization, they would feel like that was a waste of our resources. But if you actually go and make a list of how many changes can a player make to the character, and did the player experience it as intended? And the answer was yes. The design intent was for players to be able to create the character they wanted to. Players were successfully doing that at a very high rate. So that number was a really bad thing to use to measure whether or not this was a successful system. So Volition does handle diversity in a couple different ways as well I wanted to touch on briefly. I work in the department that makes surveys. We do surveys all the time. And when we do surveys, every survey we put out has gender-inclusive options on it. We do not just have male-female. And to many people, it doesn't matter. They're like, well, I fit into male or female, therefore it doesn't matter to me. Some people do get angry that we have more than male and female options, which I find really confusing. But to the people for whom they want other options, that they want to have an inclusive option for them, to take a survey from a big faceless company like Volition, and to see that we recognize that they're there, we acknowledge them as a legitimate part of our fan base, to have non-binary on our survey means a ton. And so we make sure that whenever we do, especially outward-facing stuff that goes to the community, that we always kind of double-check ourselves and make sure that we're not falling into our own personal biases, that we are acknowledging the diversity of the fan base. And along those lines, we started conducting an annual fan census. Basically, we put a survey out to our fans on social media, and we asked them, who are you? How old are you? What country do you live in? What gender do you identify with? Tell us about the games you've been playing recently. Did you pirate our games? Please be honest. We ask them all sorts of questions. And then we turn around and present this data to our studio. Because even as game devs, we have a really outdated view of who a gamer is. Because most people have this idea kind of floating around in their back of the head that a gamer is a 17-year-old dude in their parents' basement, cursing over Xbox Live while playing Call of Duty. And that is so far from who the average gamer is right now, it's not even funny. The average gamer is in his 30s. He's a parent. He has a full-time job. He comes home and wants to spend an hour or two playing a game and having fun. And I say he because 56% of gamers are male. The most recent ESA survey says that 44% of gamers are women. And in fact, the average female gamer is 9 years older than the average male gamer. Because how many of you have a mom at home who likes to play Candy Crush or something along those lines? Now, your mom probably doesn't identify as a gamer. If you asked your mom, are you a gamer? They'd be like, oh no. How much time have you spent playing Candy Crush, Mom? Because that kind of qualifies you. And that's a problem we have, is that a lot of people are even hesitant to identify themselves as gamers. But they are out there. They are purchasing titles. My mom would probably never identify as a gamer if you flat out asked her, and she's put over 100 hours into Diablo 3. There's obviously a disconnect in our society when most other people would probably look at her and say, oh, no way, or she's a filthy casual, when obviously that's not true. And so by taking a fan census and an actual picture of people who identify as fans of Volition in our games, and then we put those numbers in front of our studio, we're just trying to help our own dev team keep it in the back of their minds as they work on our games, who they're making games for. Because it's not a 17-year-old kid in his mom's basement anymore. And then when we handle our social media, we really focus on sharing and supporting how our fans choose to interact with our titles. And so that's another way that we really help support the diversity of our fan base, is by just repeating it and giving them a platform to show off the things that they like to do and the way they are fans of our games. So basically, studies support that increased emotional attachment to characters and the ability to see oneself represented and present in those characters can increase the likelihood of continued play of a title. In some players, this isn't everybody. Those are, once again, those buzzwords, player retention, that everyone wants to talk about. So this is how providing better character representation can improve your bottom line, keeping your players longer in your title. So at Volition, by providing diverse NPCs, and so from the we've been doing this customizable boss, we offer a wide array of players a character they can form an attachment to. But that is not the only way it's done in the industry. So we now talk about other games and how they also handle this same issue. So basically, there are a ton of different ways to handle diversity and inclusivity. And so specifically, these are ways that you can handle having a main character. So first of all, there's some very successful titles out there that don't have a protagonist, don't have a main character at all. Talked about Candy Crush already, but Tetris, you're not inhabiting any character in Tetris, you are just playing Tetris. There is no main character in Tetris whatsoever. There is just really addictive music. The pros, this is accessible to everybody. Nobody is being left out when it comes to these games. But the downside is there's also nothing there for a player to identify with. Lots of studies also show, especially if you look at the presence and telepresence studies, that just having even a rough human avatar can give responses to the user can increase the emotions of the player that user feels about their interactions with that particular computer, or game in this case. So, some games obscure the main character in some way. So on the left we have Journey, which totally hides gender. There's some hints towards an ethnic background here just based off of the clothes and the fact that you have a desert setting does read Middle Eastern. And then, of course, we have Metroid as a really classic example. Pros, once again, accessible to everyone because people see a very human-looking avatar, and they tend to project what they want to see onto that. The best example being most people, the first time they played through Metroid, assumed it was a dude, because that's what they had been socially prepped to assume. So the fact that it turned out to not be a male character at all was a big deal when that game first came out, because by obscuring the form, everyone got to see what they wanted, and then shock value at the end. Guess what? It's a lady. The cons here is that you have really restrained storytelling. If you're not giving away any aspects of this character's background or who they are, obviously you can't tell as deep of a story. Or if you do tell a deep story, it's really difficult. And once again, there's less there for a player to identify with. Obviously, we're kind of giving you the blank canvas thing, but there's not as much of that deep psychological reaction of this person is someone I relate to. So, the Saints Row bread and butter, customization. So some games allow characters to be customized. Examples here, we've got Dragon Age, we've got Fallout. You'll notice this tends to come, especially really deep customization systems, tend to come from the same studios over and over and over. And there's a really good reason for that. So while customization is accessible to everybody within the bounds of the system, and by that I mean not everybody identifies with the race of an elf, and so especially some fantasy games, you don't have real-world elements recreated faithfully. You have more constrained storytelling. I talked about, us going through Saints Row and looking for any instances in which the gender of the character was mentioned. Imagine how hard it is to write a game where you can never reference the main character in almost any way, besides calling them boss, which is how we handle it in Saints Row. It's also really resource intensive. I'm going to be blunt with this one. Doing customization like we do in Saints Row isn't easy. It requires a really skilled team, and it requires a ton of resources. And it requires a lot of support from the whole studio. You need to plan for this kind of resource allotment during pre-production and during production and fully support it. It needs to be something you're dedicated to. Customization, having a playable female character, for example, isn't something you're going to tack on at the end of the development process. It needs to be a core element of the design decision from the beginning. And like I said, there's only a couple studios that tend to do this a lot. And it's because they've got the tech down, and they've got their process down. And so now they've invested in it, they can kind of reuse that same thing over and over again. Because this can be a really hard thing to build from the ground up. So next you get kind of cast of character selections, which is where you are provided with like a lineup basically, and you're told pick which character you would like to play. So on the left we have Overwatch, not as yet come out, but boy does Blizzard keep announcing more and more characters for this game. I think they just announced 2 this week. And on the other side we have Borderlands. Pros. Now we're finally able to develop really deep authored experiences. Because this is a character, this character has a name, character has a gender, has sexuality, has an ethnicity, has a backstory. You can more easily tell a story about that character because these things aren't in flux anymore. And you're able to provide a variety of characters that your players might identify with. But the cons are you're not able to represent all characters. So unlike the character customization option, you are understandably limiting them to the number of characters you're providing. And you're obviously never going to create the perfect character for every possible player you might have in your title. And while you're able to develop deeper story experiences, now your storytelling resources are getting divided. Let's say you decide you want to have 10 characters in your game, now your poor writing team is having to develop backstories and personalities for 10 different characters. So customization has its own resource problems, but then here resource problems are being shifted elsewhere. And then we get to kind of the bread and butter, what most video games rely on really heavily, which is your authored character, which is you're going to have usually one. I put GTA 5 up there because it's an interesting exception that it has multiple playable characters that you switch between. So usually one, not always, but usually one explicitly designed character. That the design intention was that you experience the story through this exact character. Pros. story's only on one character, so you can go really deep on that particular individual. And a pro is that as a designer, you can force players into experiences that are outside of their comfort zone. Maybe this is a player who has never experienced what it's like to play a gay character in a video game. You can force them to experience some interesting things via your video game that they may not have experienced in real life. Kind of a walk a mile in someone else's shoes idea. Your cons are that you obviously have really limited representation here. You know, only a certain subgroup of your players are going to have that innate connection to the character you've created. And players can sometimes be really discomforted by the experiences you present them with. I have a really great example from playtesting. We talked about how we have the romance system in Saints Row 4, press X to romance. Well, it used to not say romance, it used to say proposition. We learned our lesson. Proposition isn't as well read equally across all of our player base. Basically, some people don't know what that word means. So we had a situation where we had a particular playtester, he was going along, he came to the first time he ever saw that prompt. Press X to proposition. Clearly didn't know what the word meant and pressed X. And started a gay sex scene. And he got really mad. He was actually furious with us that we had tricked him into having gay sex, which is something he was not emotionally prepared for, apparently. If we had not been paying him to be sitting in that chair playing our game for 3 days, I am fully confident he would have put down the controller and walked away and never touched that game again. We had pushed this particular player into such an uncomfortable position in our game that he would have stopped playing our game. And so this is a risk you have, is that you get a chance to encourage people to experience things they may not have experienced in real life, but some of your players may not be ready for that. And this can end up being a little risky, which is why with these authored characters, they tend to play it really safe. This is where you see your predominance of white guys, because market research has shown that playing as a white guy tends to be seen as safe. Because even if you're not a white guy, if you grew up in this society, you have been so often exposed to media where what you're expected to do is empathize with a white male character that you kind of do anyways. And so I, as a female, frequently play video games where I play as a male character. I'm used to this. But sometimes gamers who aren't used to being asked to experience things outside of their comfort zone have a hard time adjusting when this kind of stuff happens. So the more interesting things about forcing players into experiences tends to happen more in indie games than you see in AAA. And then you get the games that go for the have our cake and eat it too option, where they have an authored experience in single player, but they allow customization in multiplayer. For the story elements, they really want that authored character, but when the story isn't a point anymore, then they can allow players to fool around. And so here we have GTA Online and Call of Duty Advanced Warfare over there. So basically it comes down to, if you're interested in this area, what can you do? Well, the first thing to recognize is the gaming industry has a ton of momentum right now and a lot wrapped up in maintaining the status quo. We're really heavily cis, straight, white dudes in this industry. I'm not hating, Volition is too. Volition is approximately 85% male, for example. And that is pretty standard for the industry as a whole. And diversity can almost be seen as risky. Adding diverse mechanics, having diverse characters, to some people is seen as a risky business move. And a really great example is Naughty Dog decided to run focus testing before they released Last of Us. And they hired a focus testing firm to do this for them. And they didn't figure out until way at the end that by default, this focus testing firm excluded all female participants. By default. We don't need those females. They don't buy our games anyways. And this was the focus testing, the group they'd hired, who specializes in focus testing for video games. And so Naughty Dog actually had to say, wait a second, don't you notice we have female characters really prevalent in our title? There's a female character on the box art. For us, it is important to know what our, female players are thinking. And so they did get the focus test company to then run some focus tests with female participants. But by default, without even conferring with Naughty Dog, they had decided that women did not make up a large enough percentage of the player base to be worth asking questions of. And this was only like 3 years ago. This isn't a story from a decade ago of the industry as it used to be. This is fairly current. And so this is just a really great example of kind of this snowball effect. Oh, we're not asking these minority players what they feel because they didn't buy our last title. Well, then we design a game that doesn't have any of their interests in mind, and we release this game and they don't buy it a lot, therefore there's no way we need to ask them their opinions about our next one either. So the biggest thing you can do is be aware, you, if you're making a game, are not representative of your entire player base. There's no way. You can't be. Unless you are designing a game for like one other person, and you know them really well because they're your best friend. And just being actively aware of this and keeping it in the back of your mind can help combat your own personal biases. Because I mentioned cognitive biases earlier, and we tend to view them all as evil because it's a bad thing that you have a cognitive bias. It's just a pattern. It's a pattern of how human brains tend to work. And you are never going to erase these patterns entirely from your own self, because you are a human and you have a brain. And so just what you can do, though, is do things to try and be more aware of them and try and combat them. And so there's a ton of cognitive biases. I could have done a whole presentation on those, on the types of things that impact our ability to empathize with other people's experiences. You're going to design a game with yourself in mind by default. And you have to step out of your own comfort zone as a developer to think about what the player experience is going to be from other people's perspectives. Ask questions. Encourage other people on your team to ask questions. This is a really important part. Why is this character white? Is that a crucial part of their backstory? Because with an industry that's 85% male and that's really heavily Caucasian, we end up having a lot of characters that start off life as white males just because that's seen as the default setting. And it shouldn't be. And so sometimes all it needs is someone to ask the question of, why have we made this choice? And then it gets other people thinking, oh, there isn't a reason why this character is white, why this character is male, why this character is straight. Maybe here's room for us to include some more diversity. Here's room for us to bring it in. Why are all the enemies male? How many times have you played a video game and noticed that every single enemy you go up against is male? This happens a lot. And this is actually, so pushing for things like gender parity in enemies can be an area where it's not even your main story characters, but you can still have better representation in your title. It's another area to start adding diversity. Be aware of stereotypes and tokenism. You're never going to avoid it 100%. This is a really hard area. Stereotypes can be really easy shortcuts to rely on when you're telling a story. If you don't have a lot of time to convey a bunch of information about a character to your player, stereotypes can shortcut you to giving, I'm going to have an urban black male and put his hat on sideways, and now I'm suddenly conveying a whole bunch of gangster stereotypes. And that can be really damaging at the same time. It's a shortcut as a writing shortcut, a storytelling shortcut, but you can easily fall into the trap of just repeating damaging stereotypes. And so this is something that you really want to watch out for. As you try, you're like, now I'm going to actively try to increase the diversity of my title, but at the same time you might fall into the trap of using stereotypes, or the other side of having token characters. You're like, I'm so dedicated to diversity, look at this awesome gay character I designed. Is the gay character only in your game because they're gay? And if so, maybe we're having a little bit of a problem here. You want gay to be but an aspect of their personality. You want a whole bunch more backstory. They happen to be gay. Because gay isn't the defining point of any one human being. It shouldn't be the defining point of any one character in a game either. Do your research. This may seem a little weird, but if you're including a character that's outside of your own life experiences, be really sensitive about how you handle that. Read about this particular culture you want to represent. Listen to other people. Go as far as to invite people of that particular group to come in and share their experiences with you. Try and increase the diversity on your own team. Yeah, I'm a white developer. I don't want to just tell other people's stories and make sure I tell them right. Other people should be able to tell their own stories. And this is an area the video game industry has real problems with. We are a very homogenous group of people. And many studios are now starting to have that conversation of how do we increase the diversity of our own teams. Because just having diverse teams, having more voices, more life experiences represented on your own team will start to address some of these problems automatically. I end up in the weird position of frequently having to be the voice for all minorities in gaming. The people look to me as, oh, Elizabeth, do you think that this ethnic character is being handled in a poor way? I'm like, I'm not that ethnicity. I can try and offer you another opinion, but I shouldn't be the end-all, be-all for that particular question. So the long-term fix, basically, in the industry as a whole is to move towards having a more diverse group of people creating games to begin with. And what can you do? You can be really awesome. That's a great place to start. And understand you're going to make mistakes. As you make media, as you put that media out, you're going to screw up sometimes. You can't be representative of every person in your fan base and your player base, and along those same lines, as hard as you try, you're still going to make mistakes. Just be willing to learn from them. Take critiques well. This is a hard thing for a lot of people. It takes a lot of practice to take critique. And believe me, when you're a big AAA studio, you get a lot of fan mail that is giving you wonderful critiques of your games and your choices. And it really can be easy to be like, oh, well, those angry fanboys over there. But it is still important to listen to them and to listen to the information that you're being given. Even one voice in a company or on a team can make a difference. One person being willing to speak up and talk about it can make other people who maybe feel the same way but don't feel comfortable talking out loud feel more comfortable voicing their opinions. It works slowly towards creating an environment where everyone feels more comfortable talking and bringing up their concerns. And so it can be really hard, and I am not saying that everyone needs to feel comfortable. I had a hard time becoming the person who's willing to actively question. Because you always run the risk, especially, I run the risk of coming across as nagging, coming across as bitchy, coming across as, oh, that Elizabeth, she's always causing problems. And I obviously don't want to be that person. I don't want the other people on my team to feel that way about me. But I also find this particular issue important enough that I'm willing to risk those kinds of things. I'm willing to start hard conversations. And by me pushing forward and being a very vocal voice in my particular company, I'm hoping it's allowing other people who work at Volition to feel a little bit more comfortable coming forward as well. It's also put me in an interesting position, and once again, as I said, if people now come to me, or they'll use me in a threatening way in meetings, oh, you're going to make that decision? Wait till Zelle finds out about it, and things along those lines, which is weird. I don't want to be a weapon that's wielded in the name of diversity. But on the other hand, it means that in some meeting I'm not at, people are talking about diversity. That I'm not there, but some combat team is having a discussion about having more female enemies. And so maybe me having a voice and talking about it is having a positive effect elsewhere in my company now, even when I'm not there. And remember, you don't have to be perfect. You just don't be an asshole about it. It's a sad thing to say, but the bar is really low in video games right now. Video games are really young compared to other media, like compared to TV or movies. We're kind of just starting to figure this stuff out. We're starting to work on things that other forms of media have been trying to address for a while already. We're playing catch up. And so the bar is really low. To be a company that's actively seen as being a good company, as being a company that's trying, that's really embracing diversity, you don't even have to do that much. You just have to not be a dick to your fan base. And so you just keep trying, realize that having the perfectly diverse, inclusive game is never going to happen, but it is a goal that you can always keep working towards. So basically, just keep making awesome games and iterating on your own particular style. And you're going to find that there is a fan base who really enjoys what you're working on, and what you're doing is going to respond positively to it. And on a fun final note, most of the illustrations that you saw in this presentation, things that weren't graphs, were actually fan art that I pulled from Tumblr. That is not just fan art, that is fan art of people's bosses that they created in Saints Row customization systems. So if you want another lesson about how impactful the emotional connection can be to a character in a video game, these people created characters in a game that's over 2 years old at this point. So this isn't even like a recent flush of fans. And they created a character in our customization system that doesn't even have a name in our game. We just refer to this character as the boss. That they have such a strong emotional attachment to that they then go online and post fan art that they have created. They write fanfic about these characters that we have created. People do mods to expand our customization systems so they have more options. And so it's very anecdotal, of course, and not at all scientifically valid, but you can look at the fact that these fans have such a strong emotional attachment that they go and make fan art as a really strong indicator that having a diverse character cast and having characters people can relate to really does work. So basically, shout out to all the fans who do this kind of stuff, because I think it's really cool. And because I'm a scientist, of course, I have works cited. So this is my recommended reading page. Anytime I had a direct quote from a particular publication in this presentation, that publication is listed here. And added bonus, none of these are behind paywalls. So even if you don't have academic access, these are all papers that you can read if you're interested. Q&A. All right, we'll start here.
You went over the different types of games and how they choose to have characters, whether or not you customize them or select them from a list. Is there one that you would really focus on, or is it really just the customization system that you think is really just the best, even though it is resource intensive, but like paring it down?
I don't think it's the only way. And that's the kind of the thing, is that basically there is a player need and there's multiple ways to address it. And it really depends on the type of game you want to make. For like Saints Row 4, for example, customization was clearly the best answer. But on the other hand, I think that Tomb Raider is an amazing title that I'm really happy exists. Because you do get this advantage with authored characters of knowing, this isn't just I happen to create the character that's cool. Someone specifically designed this character that I feel an emotional attachment to. So that has an added bonus to it. So basically what it comes down to is we've currently been using the customization as our way to answer that need, but it's definitely not the best way out there.
Two things. Could you repeat the questions so that we can hear it?
Yeah, absolutely.
And have you thought about having main characters that are animals, or like just fantasy non-existent characters as another way to handle diversity?
Yeah, that's definitely a way. The Khajiit is a great example. And obviously, there's a ton of games that utilize like the fantasy aspects. You look at how attached people get to their World of Warcraft characters. You look at games like Dragon Age, which has a bunch of other fantasy races as well. People aren't limited to just forming attachments to humanoid, basically, characters. And it's definitely an additional way that you can kind of say, hey, this is kind of plays off of the hidden character option. It allows people a canvas on which to project their own feelings. I personally play Skyrim and now Elder Scrolls Online as an orc. I can't tell you why playing as an orc appeals to me, but in basically all of the Elder Scrolls games, I always create a female orc. I don't know why. But for me, orcs seem to speak really strongly to me. All right, in the corner.
Are your slides available somewhere?
I can post them online. Yes, I will post all my slides. All right.
Is there going to be a Saints Row 5?
That is not something I can speak to. Yes, if Volition has not announced a title, then I am completely restricted by NDA from talking about anything we're currently doing. Yes?
I understand being aware of stereotypes
Mhm.
and researching and stuff, but do you have any solutions to when stereotypes align with reality, you know?
Statistically validated stereotypes. That's a hard.
Repeat questions. Repeat questions.
Yeah. So basically the question was, I talk about avoiding stereotypes, but what do you do when you have stereotypes that kind of align with reality? And basically the situation there is that you don't want to say, I am so afraid of stereotypes that I'm going to erase a particular subculture. You want to avoid that as well. And that's why on that particular slide I said be aware of stereotypes, not completely avoid them. There are some stereotypes that are significantly more damaging than others. And so that's where you really want to be careful, because I can say, oh yes, this West Coast gang stereotype we had pulled really heavily on for the early Saints Row games, that was pulling from a real subculture. And I'm not saying that no one should ever touch on that subculture or try and creatively pull from that subculture. But just make sure that if you are, you're doing it in a particularly sensitive way to avoid repeating hurtful stereotypes. Yes?
Based off all the Saints Row's released so far, have there ever been moments where you all look back at the older customizations and go, we could totally take this a lot farther, or were there like hindrances to and reasons why you couldn't go as far as you wanted to?
All right, so looking back at our older Saints Row games, because we do have 4 now spanning a course of not quite a decade, are there any things about our older games, particularly the customization systems, that we look back on and maybe wish we could bring forward or see potential in? Absolutely. Particularly in Saints Row 2, we had the gender slider, where gender wasn't a binary, and we allowed people to play a gender ambiguous character. And I personally really wish we could do that again. I think that that was really important, and that was representing something that almost never gets covered in any video game or any customization system. I understand why we got rid of it from a technical standpoint, on the resources on the back end. We moved a completely different way of handling animations, and so that made it a lot easier if we just could select a binary for the character of what kind of animation set they were going to play. But I really do see the value in it and wish that we could bring that forward and find a way to implement that into future titles. Yes?
Can I ask 2 questions?
Sure.
My first one was, can you represent all stereotypes, or if you need to lean on those for your game, can you really do that in a positive light for every stereotype? And who handled marketing for the Saints Row games? And just in general, you'll see like they'll have a base white male for most games when they do marketing.
The first question was about stereotypes again. And is every stereotype have kind of a positive way that you can present them, right? Okay. And the answer there is definitely no. There's some stereotypes that I think probably shouldn't be brought forward. But it gets really hard because it kind of is a fine-tuned, you want to take each thing as an individual. And that's definitely a situation where I would highly recommend bringing in individuals of that particular culture or subculture and kind of trying to let other people tell the story more than just being the interpretive lens through which you tell someone else's story. And then your second question was about marketing for the Saints Row games. And just games in general. I can speak specifically about Saints Row, definitely, because that's kind of where I come from. So fairly recently, our publisher, THQ, went bankrupt. We were put up for auction, our entire company. It was kind of a stressful day at the office. And we were acquired by a completely different publisher, which is Deep-Silver, which is out of Munich in Germany. So we've had recently a complete swing in how our marketing is handled. Because at almost all game studios, marketing decisions are not handled at the studio level. They're handled at the big publisher level. And I'm of course talking about AAA, because that's where I'm coming from. It's completely different if you get into the indie scene. And the problem, you do end up getting a situation where marketing decisions tend to really be based off of very maintained status quo, don't take any risks Under THQ, we did a lot of porn star-based marketing for the Saints Row series, which was an interesting choice. They were definitely going for the angle of it's teenage guys who are playing our games, therefore let's bring in a porn star. It was, I don't know if it was successful, I don't have marketing numbers. I know that I was personally a little discomforted as an employee of the studio to know that we were only representing ourselves in a very tits and ass kind of way. Example, when we were at E3 for Saints Row 3, they actually hired a bunch of models to wear bikinis and do a car wash outside of E3. And I almost feel like if they just thrown some studly guys in Speedos so it wasn't just tits and ass, at least we would have kind of gone for that equal opportunity thing. And yeah, we do lean really heavily on having just a white male avatar in a lot of our advertising. I personally wish we'd go away from that. We've started experimenting. You'll see some of our ads will actually have a main character that, instead of it just being the white guy walking down the street, it'll flash back and forth between all of these different customization options to showcase you don't have to play this game as this character, you can play this game as anything. But definitely video game marketing as a whole has a real resistance towards female characters. You'll hear the story that Life is Strange had a really hard time finding a publisher because all the publishers kept telling them, we won't publish this unless you change the main character to be a male, because female games aren't marketable. And eventually they found Square Enix, who was willing to take their game as it was, and Life is Strange is a pretty awesome game. If you haven't been playing it, I highly recommend it. Marketing is definitely, though, a little behind and tends to rely really more heavily on the whole white male gamer stereotype. All right, yes?
Hi.
Hi.
So, you guys like to not follow stereotypes, but still hit the satire area that people are like, oh, that's naughty. So, how do you feel about people who do absolutely go, like, as you say, balls to the wall, stereotype satire? Like, now that they're entering the gaming world, I can actually drop their name, South Park,
Yeah.
who, like, goes all in, and they insult everyone, like, no one is safe.
That's definitely South Park's brand, and they have a long history of being able to do it and being able to do it pretty well. I think that any other IP would have been really wary of going that far. I really think any other IP being that offensive wouldn't have been able to find a publisher particularly easily because it had the South Park brand attached to it. They were able to. I think there's totally room for that in games. If there's room for that on television, there's room for it in games as well. I'm definitely not a person who says you can't have a certain type of video game because some people might be offended by it. I would just personally like to see video games as a whole become more diverse as a whole. There's room for everybody, basically. Yes?
What's your favorite video game besides Saints Row?
Okay. Saints Row is definitely not my favorite video game, I'll be honest. Every Saints Row game I have ever worked on is still in the shrink wrap, because once you have played a game for hundreds of hours during the development process, you are never interested in playing it again. Working as a game dev can ruin video games for you. Favorite game? That's a really hard question that I'm not at all prepared for. Right now I'd have to say Crusader Kings 2 from Paradox. It's a medieval strategy game. You get to play a dynasty of a particular kingdom throughout the whole medieval period. You get to engage in sabotage and wars and kill people behind their back, and it's very much a menus the game kind of game, but for me it's totally something I can pour hundreds of hours into. Alright. Yes, you.
Is there a recent game that really had its chance to build a diverse cast of characters, or one particular character that then you think the developers may have blown their chance or just done it terribly?
Well, we'll talk about kind of the elephant in the room. Last year's Assassin's Creed. Women are too hard to animate. We'll talk about that. They said we're going to have some customization options for multiplayer. We're going to let people pick a character and kind of design a character roughly. It's a great opportunity. Sure, great. I talked about it. It's a very valid strategy. Single player is an often character, multiplayer, less customization. And then they said, but you can't play as a woman. And there was a huge amount of backlash from that, understandably. And I think the problem there was not so much women are too hard to animate. And it was more just, they clearly said, well, if we'd had time, we would have made time to have female playable characters. We just ran out of time. But anyone who's ever worked on any project ever knows you never have extra time come up at the end. There's never this mythical extra amount of time for you to work on fun projects at the end of development. You're always right up against the deadlines. And so it's just clear it wasn't a high priority for their team. And I wish it had been. Because if you're going to have customization as an option, please make it actual customization as an option. I dinged our own title for not letting you change gender in the original Saints Row. And so for me, that's when games try hard and completely fail the most, is when they get almost there. And they just have, it would be so easy to just let me play as a female, please, in every game. I would love it. There was a really great video, the Kids React series, and they played Super Meat Boy. And this little girl was only 5 years old. She's playing around, and she's like, why can't I play as the female meat blob? You're like, excellent question, 5-year-old girl. Why can't you play as the female meat blob? Is there any reason for the story that this has to be a male meat blob? All you have to do is throw a flower or a bow on the character and change it, and nothing else would be particularly different about the gameplay there. And so even little kids realize that having the option to play differently can be really valuable. So I would say any game that only kind of half-asses customization really gets me more than anything else. All right, over here.
Character creation tends to be the realm of science fiction and fantasy.
Yeah.
And that goes all the way back to tabletop
Yeah.
RPGs. But I don't, as I understand it, Saints Row doesn't really fall within that paradigm. So specifically, how does Volition use genre as a tool toward the end of diversity and inclusivity, and in general, how can the video game industry do the same?
All right. So customization tends to be sci-fi fantasy genres, which generally is really limited to that. Volition with Saints Row is kind of busted out of that. And how do we play around with genre and the use of character customization? We definitely do it on purpose. We occupy a really unique spot, basically, in modern AAA gaming for that reason. And I've seen fan mail come directly to me about how I like playing third-person shoot-'em-up crazy games, and the fact that I can play a butch lesbian wearing Birkenstocks and cargo pants while doing so is really awesome. Because it very frequently is this sci-fi fantasy genre that allows you that, and if you want to see a very realistic, kind of down-to-earth version of yourself, that's very limited in games as a whole. Basically, maybe you can go to The Sims. And so we're definitely playing around with that and breaking kind of genre rules about what a shoot-'em-up third-person game does with its main character. And I would be really interested in seeing the industry as a whole have more opportunities like that. Of, this kind of power fantasy of being the badass wielding a machine gun, mowing down bad guys on the street in an urban open world environment shouldn't be limited to only specific types of characters. There's totally room there for that to have character customization or kind of the cast of character approach. And I would totally like to see more studios be willing to kind of take that genre risk and not be so kind of forced into one particular corner. All right, yes?
What are your thoughts on how Rust dealt with character generation?
Okay, Rust. How did Rust... Rust handled character generation in a really interesting way. They're the ones that kind of randomized, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, Rust did this really interesting kind of experiment with their players, which is when you created a character in the game for the first time, it rolled a die to see what you would look like, and then you couldn't change it. You got assigned an ethnicity by the game, and you couldn't change it. And from a like a psychologist perspective, it was fascinating. Because you saw all these people get really angry about, I don't want to play as a black character, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, well, welcome to what life has been like for every black gamer for a long time. You know, that this is the reality for a lot of gamers out there, that they are very often forced to play characters they don't personally connect to. But I can also understand where people were having problems, especially in games that are multiplayer games. There's a huge social aspect to multiplayer games. This is the avatar I'm creating very purposely to interact with other people. And so having some of those options taken away from a player is really frustrating, and I honestly would probably be frustrated if I was given a system that I knew could allow me to design the character I wanted, but wasn't. Was very purposely saying, here's a toy you could have, but I'm taking it away from you. So, like, as a scientist, I find it fascinating, and I would love to see research on people's reactions, but as a gamer, I actually kind of end up falling more on the side of, if I were playing that title, I would want to have the complete control of what my character looked like. Yes?
Okay, you already explained the pros and cons of like the different kinds of main characters and character customization versus authored characters. My question is, do you think that companies should or will eventually, if they're not already, go more in the direction of character creations from minimal to vast? Because a lot of people I talk to outside of the department, or sometimes my own family members, would be like, oh, it'd be really cool if we had some form of character creation here, and I would look at the game and I'd think, I don't know if that would make sense in The Witcher 3.
Basically, do I think that other studios might move towards more of the use of character customization?
Yeah, since it's kind of getting up there in popularity.
Yeah, since it's increasing in popularity. And I think it really does come down to designer intention. What is the intended player experience for a particular title? And for any title that has the room to allow for customization, I think you might start to see more character customization, more cast of character options, things like that that allow more flexibility in the types of games that have the room for it. So some games that are really strongly character driven, Witcher 3 is a great example that you gave, there's not really a lot of room in there. So it really depends on what a particular studio and design team's intentions are. And so I think you're going to start to see a divide of people who traditionally just made kind of generic dude bro characters as their main character, who realize that you have room in here for options and inserting options where they haven't been before. But some games are always going to remain very clear authored stories because it does allow a lot more flexibility for the writing team to convey a very particular storyline, like you saw in the Witcher series.
Yeah.
Yes?
Yeah, I was just wondering, when you guys were getting your research for how long players stay in character creation, was that just the character creation in the beginning? Because I know with Saints Row you can change your character later in the game. Were you also checking those times as well?
So the question was, in the data I talked about how players utilize Saints Row's customization, was it just initial customization or was it throughout the entire game? The data I presented was just initial player customization. Basically you end up with a couple of confounding variables if you look at the game as a whole. One, we have an achievement attached to changing your gender. It's called Switch Hitter. If you play 2 hours as a male and 2 hours as a female, you unlock an achievement. So we are actively encouraging and rewarding players for changing their gender. So once you get past a certain point outside of initial customization, people may be being influenced by other variables than just recreating something that they really have some kind of emotional attachment to. So for that particular data, I was only looking at how they utilized the initial customization system. For post-release data, we have tons of information about the kinds of changes that people make, how often people go back into customization, what they do there, how often they buy clothes and other kinds of customization options they have. But once again, you end up with so many different variables that it can be hard to suss out player intention just from numbers. And so that's actually one of the hard parts of our job, is people want to know, players have fun. And we're like, yes, 7.9 funds, definitely. So there's definitely a lot of questions about why players engage in behavior that are really, really hard to answer. I can tell you what their behavior trends looked like, but then when I get into guessing as to why they're doing that and what kind of emotions they may have attached to it, that's when user research can get real fuzzy real fast. Yes?
Kind of to play devil's advocate here,
Yeah.
but when do you start to cut off critique? I don't remember the entire story, and it was more because of the representation of their god and Smite.
Mm-hmm.
They had to change how Kali looked, but you could say that one of those things was, oh, well, her boobs are all out. She looks like this. She's a very idealized feminine figure. When do you start to cut off critiques to keep your intellectual property yours?
All right, basically, how much do you listen to critique? And when is there a point when you cut off basically listening to it? Basically, we keep listening, but we have a point where we are the developers. It is our game. And a lot of times you end up with people who feel such a strong emotional connection to the title, they feel kind of a sense of ownership, of I am such a super fan of your series that you have to listen to me. You have to listen to my opinion. You definitely get that type of fan. And it can be really a hard balance to strike because they're still a fan. They still want to engage with us. They're still following us on social media, but they can be particularly negative a lot. And maybe they're making suggestions that we as developers know we're never going to go in that direction again. And it's definitely a hard balance to find. But what it really comes down to is in the end, we're the creators. It's our vision of what the game is going to be. We are trying to be really thoughtful about who our intended player is, what our intended player's needs are, what they would want to see. But in the end, video games occupy this interesting space of they're not just a consumable, they're also kind of a piece of art. And we have some say in what the arty side is, what the experiential side is. And so there comes a point where you stop listening. That you're just like, I acknowledge you, what you're saying is legitimate, but we as creators are going our own direction for whatever reason. And some designers and dev teams explain it to a fan base, and frequently you get designers and dev teams who don't because they're not required to explain to the fan base every single choice they've decided to make in a particular game series. If we went and answered every angry YouTuber who left a comment or made an angry video, every person who got on our Twitter account and was angry at us and we tried to personally address each person's concerns, we would never stop working, basically. So it's just in the end, you are the creator, you do get the final say on these things, and you're trying as hard as possible to take other people's opinions into account since they are the people who are purchasing your title, but you have to kind of find a balance of how much am I willing to give up of my own creative control. Yes?
This is just a random question.
Yeah?
In your personal preference, when you're doing character customization, sets versus sliders, which do you prefer?
Oh, sets versus sliders. When customizing, I prefer sliders. The data says sets are probably fine. Basically, I acknowledge I am an outlier from how I use customization systems when I'm given that option. A lot of the data basically says that, companies like Saints Row with their huge sliders to pick from, that we're giving players a knob that goes from 0 to 10, but the majority of players probably only care about that area between 2 and 3. That they're probably, we know from our data, most players aren't getting in there, adjusting and fine-tuning all of the different nose options. I do when I customize, because that's the type of player I am. But I recognize also that I am not representative of the majority of the fan base, and I also have access to a terabyte of data that tells me I am not representative of how the average Saints Row player utilizes our customization system either. So, like I said, personal answer, I like sliders, but if you were developing a game and you were concerned about resource management, you would probably be just fine going with sets, and you would fulfill the needs of most of your players. Yes?
Do you ever publish any of your research externally?
Do I ever publish my research? No. If you are reading about games studies, you will really, really quickly realize that there is games academia and there is games industry, and never the twain shall meet. There is very little overlap between academic research about games and the people in the industry who are actually making them. Do I think that is ideal? Absolutely not. The people on the academic side would love to have access to these terabytes of data that I'm talking about. But then you end up with a lot of privacy concerns within video game development. We can't let outsiders look at our data. We can't let outsiders have access, especially to projects that are still in development or unannounced. It can be really hard to do those things. There's also the problem of the type of science I'm doing in the industry can be fairly dirty science. It is not to academic vigor standards. And that's just because that's the needs of working in industry. It's not just video game industry. Like any scientist who's working, trying to provide data for industrial needs is going to have the same situation. If I need to turn my data around real fast. Generally, like the example I was giving, Saints Row 4 playtesting, 10 weeks of playtesting leading up to the submission of that title. 10 solid weeks of playtesting in a row. That is 3 days of playtesting every week. That is a person sitting in the playtest lab observing 8 playtesters. That's recruiting 8 playtesters for every week. That is having, these playtesters are taking a survey every 30 minutes and filling out their impressions of what they've been doing lately in the game. They're also taking a survey before lunch and taking a survey at the end of the day, and then we have an interview process at the end of the 3rd day. That's a ton of data, and we turn it around in a week. Within 1 week, we have a report out to our development team, giving them all of the rundown of the major concerns, the major areas of confusion and failure. In 1 week. No one in academia would ever be turning around data that quickly. And because of that, we are not collecting data at the same standards as someone who is publishing academically would be, because it just wouldn't be possible to combine those two needs. If you go back to my slide here, exactly one of these papers has someone from industry as an author. One of them. And that's Ian Livingston in the second one. He's at Ubisoft. So this is an area that I would like to see a lot more connection between, because I, as a user researcher, am really fascinated by the data that's coming out of academic games research. And I would like to get have more interaction with this. I'd like to support this. If someone wants to make me their co-author, that would be awesome. But the type of data that we tend to collect in the industry is just not solid enough, probably, to get past academic standards, unfortunately. Up there?
So, Brenda Romero is a pretty famous video game developer, and something that she told a group that I was a part of, said she's found that if you give a talk, like exactly what you're doing right now, about, for example, women in games, the people who show up are the people who don't need to hear it, they're already convinced. And I have a sinking feeling that this room is full of people who are already convinced.
Yes.
So do you have any advice about dealing with that?
My hope is that my presentation maybe gave some people who are here who have like a really gut feeling about diversity and inclusivity a little bit more conviction. They're like, yeah, I'm right. And there's science that says so. Like, it's not just my personal opinion, but there's actually research out there that supports it. So hopefully everyone who leaves this presentation will go out and feel a little bit more confident in advocating for these kinds of conversations. And bringing these up to other people who didn't come attend this because they read the sign and they're like, diversity and inclusivity, that's not really for me. And it kind of comes along the ideas of, by being willing to talk publicly about it, I'm hoping that I'm spreading to other people the confidence and the conviction and the backing to also then go talk publicly about it as well. And so I assume that most people who attended this presentation didn't need convincing. But you may not have needed convincing, but now you have even more data to back you up. That you know that you can go and you can reference the virtual census And it tells you very specifically that, it's not just I feel that women are underrepresented in games, the data can back me up on that. It would be nice to have more open conversations, but that gets into that's not just a problem in this particular genre of talks. It's not a problem that's limited to just games. That's a conversation that's a human psychology problem. You tend to surround yourself with people who agree with you in general. It kind of goes along the lines, if you look at your Facebook wall, probably the majority of the people you're Facebook friends with have political ideas that agree with your own. You kind of surround yourself with people who feel the same way. So that's kind of more of a human problem than just a game development problem or a diversity in tech issue. But it's definitely worth recognizing that I'm probably not, converting someone to a completely new way of thinking this evening. But I'm hoping that I can make everybody who did attend feel a little bit stronger in going out and starting conversations on their own.
Where can we find your slides to help us do that?
I don't know. I probably will have them posted on the Volition website. If you take my card, there's a stack of them, you can follow me on Twitter, and I'll definitely tweet when my slides go live.
And we'll definitely help push that out on the IGB Chicago stuff too. The talk was recorded today, so we're really excited to share that with the community. So you all can also share and just spread the knowledge.
Yes. Spread the good cheer of diversity.
Right.
Yeah. Do you have any other questions? All right, looks like not. Thank you everybody for coming and attending. I hope that you got something out of